Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about one of the most iconic video game systems of all time. Of course I'm talking about the Atari Video Computer System, also known as the VCS for short, or it was later released as the Atari 2600. Now this console is widely considered to have started the home video game market as we know it today. And yes, there were consoles before Atari, but Atari popularized the idea of having games that could be removed and swapped out through cartridges. You can also remove the controllers and swap them out for a different style of controllers, such as the Atari joystick or the Atari paddle controller. Earlier consoles were built around a custom logic chip, but the Atari 2600 is actually built around its own CPU. In fact, it's actually a cost-reduced version of the famous 6502 CPU, which was used in famous products such as the Apple II. The system also had a ridiculously low amount of RAM, and that's because RAM was incredibly expensive, and anything such as maybe 4 kilobytes of RAM would have been prohibitively expensive and would have made the console cost thousands of dollars. So it only has 128 bytes of RAM. And just to give you an idea of how minuscule this amount is, most text files or Microsoft Word documents take up 32 kilobytes. Now usually you needed a lot of RAM in the console to be able to run the video display and be able to show all these different colors on screen. But the Atari was able to get away with having such low RAM because of a brand new device known as the Television Interface Adapter, or a TIA chip, which basically takes control of your computer screen and handles all that through that chip rather than having the additional RAM. So in 1976, Fairchild released their Channel F console, and this put pressure on Atari to deliver a console to market before all the copycat clones would come out. They had to deal with this in the early 70s when they released Pong, and a whole bunch of other people started creating copycat Pong machines that they had to compete with. So this forced Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, to sell his company to Warner Communications. He sold it in 1976 for $28 million, and on the promise that the Stella would be produced as soon as possible. Now the key to the success of the Atari Video Computer System will all come down to the hiring of one individual by the name of Jay Miner. He was able to take the entire wire wrap of the television interface adapter and condense it down into one single chip. And once that was completed and debugged, the system was ready for shipping.
Attention shoppers, the new Atari cartridge game is in.
Excuse me.
Uh-oh, George again.
Atari's ASCII battle. Oh!
I'd like an Atari.
Sorry, only our demonstrators left.
Mine!
No, George. Mine.
The new video computer system by Atari. More games, more fun.
When the Atari VCS launched, it was priced for $199, which adjusted for inflation today would be almost $786. So it was a bit on the pricey side. But it came with 2 joysticks and the game Combat. And there were 8 additional games available at launch later to buy if they wanted to. Now initially, Atari had only planned to make a certain number of games for the system because that was popular at the time, so initially they used to number their cartridges. But after a while they decided they could actually make more money by licensing games to other developers and letting them develop for the system. One other innovation that Atari made that was able to separate them from the competition was the fact that they had a computer-controlled opponent. This was the first time that many people were able to play a game by themselves without having a second player there. And so I think this also helped the console take off a little bit. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look inside the console and see what makes the Atari Video Computer System tick. By the end of 1977, Atari had sold about 250,000 video computer systems. And during the first year of production, the video computer system was actually manufactured in Sunnyvale, California, which was where Atari's headquarters were. Now, these original consoles were made out of thicker plastic and had a very thick metal case, we'll call it, that surrounded the logic board. And because this added a lot of weight, and because there were 6 switches on the front of the console instead of 4, which later consoles would have, these first consoles were nicknamed Heavy Sixers. Now, when I took apart my console, I actually realized halfway through disassembling that I had a Heavy Sixer console. And if I would have known that before I started taking it apart, I probably wouldn't have had the guts to go through with it because of my limited knowledge. but I'm very glad I did because I was able to clean it up very well, get all the dust out, and hopefully extend the life of the console just a little bit. Alright, so now that we've had a look inside the console, let's take a look at some of the games. And I'm just going to show you a couple of my personal favorites that kind of showcase what the Atari 2600 was really capable of. Now, it's almost impossible to talk about the Atari without at least talking about their downfall. And there were several underlying reasons why Atari faded away by the end of the 1980s, but I'm just going to cover a few of them, kind of the most important ones. The first one is Warner Communications did not get along well with the game developers at Atari. And there was a lot of dispute because Warner Communications would not allow game designers to get credit for their work and put it onto the product as it went out. The second one I'll cover is the attitude of Atari seemed to be along the lines of the game doesn't really have to be good, it just has to be bought. And this kind of mentality led to a string of bad games being released for the Atari that were either full of bugs, full of glitches, or just didn't play right, or they were just poorly designed. And third, Atari's plan to license arcade games kind of blew up in their face because the Atari really wasn't capable of making proper home ports of some arcade games. And this was seen very well with the home version of Pac-Man. There were a lot of complaints from consumers that not only did it not even look like Pac-Man, but it just looked ugly. The sounds were horrible. It didn't seem to play well. There was a lot of glitches. The ghosts kind of faded and didn't show up right. So this just led to a lot of limitations with the console and exposed them into the consumer's eyes. So eventually the consumer lost faith in the product, and the video game market crashed in 1983. Now, most of the blame is given to E.T. as the reason for the crash, and I kind of see this as being a bit unfair towards that game. I think that E.T. was just the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the latest game in a long stream of very highly anticipated, but very poorly made games, and I just think that E.T. was kind of the final straw, and consumers weren't going to put up with it anymore. So I think it was E.T.'s proximity, its release date, being so close to the video game crash, that E.T. gets a lot of the blame for it. Atari would try to release their console as the Atari 2800 in Japan, but it didn't come out until 1983, and this was kind of an attempt to capture the Japanese market because the North American market was dead at that point. However, there was just one problem. They released it merely weeks after Nintendo released their Famicom, which would eventually become the Nintendo Entertainment System. And with the advanced graphics capabilities and the good game designs of Nintendo, they just couldn't compete in that market, so it kind of failed off and died there too. When the North American video game market recovered, in large part to Nintendo releasing the Entertainment System, Atari again redesigned their 2600 to be cheaper and more cost-effective. It was known as the 2600 Junior, and it was priced for about $50.
$50? Now, isn't that nice? The fun is back, oh yes, sirree. It's the 2600 from Atari.
So because of the success of the 2600, many people refer to that console as the Atari. Atari actually released several consoles after that, but most people remember fondly their most popular one, which was the Atari 2600. So what are my thoughts on the Atari 2600? Well, for me, it's a lot of blind nostalgia. It was the first. It was the first video game console I remember putting a game in, powering on, and playing. So as soon as I saw it, I immediately thought of some fond childhood memories of, plugging in this game console, playing it, usually by myself or with my older brothers. So that's just something that I really enjoy about playing the console. If you didn't grow up with this console, chances are kids today would probably view the graphics and just go, what on earth were people thinking back in the day? Because if you look at games like Pitfall, that character was probably the most advanced character model that the Atari 2600 was capable of producing. Most of the time you were a block or a very poorly squared off spaceship, and a lot of times you had to use your imagination to play the game and fill in the gaps that the game console really couldn't do. So I don't know if I'd recommend this to everyone, but if you're a game collector, I would say this is a must-have. This system really isn't that expensive. I look on eBay and you can find a whole bunch of them on there for under $50, and usually you can find a lot of games or game lots that are fairly cheap and inexpensive. And even though the games aren't too long and don't take that much time to master, they are incredibly fun and addictive, sometimes more so than games that are released today. And I think game developers of today should probably take a lesson from the days of the Atari, that it doesn't really necessarily matter how good the graphics are. The gameplay is always going to dominate whether or not people play it or not. Well, that about wraps it up for this video. Remember, if you like what you see, please hit that like and subscribe button, share with a friend, and check back for future content, as I'm actually going to be producing 2 more videos in a series connected with this one. In the second video, I'm going to talk about the Mattel Intellivision, and then in the third video, I'm actually going to have the Intellivision face off against the Atari, and we're going to see which one was better. So stick around for that, and I'll see you next time. Again, thanks for watching.